One of the greatest and most dramatic sea voyages ever to have taken root in the city of Albany, New York, and yes, even perhaps the United States, got underway on December 15, 1785. Measuring a scant 60 feet and weighing just 80 tons, built in Albany of homegrown timber by local shipwrights, skippered by an Albany captain, and carrying a crew of 9, the sloop Experiment set sail against all odds into the tumultuous and unforgiving winter Atlantic. Captain Stuart Deane of Albany and his crew certainly needed to count on the grace of God and more to avoid the fate of scores of mariners who attempted less ambitious trips and from whom no word was ever heard from again. In this challenging voyage captained by Stuart Deane, the Experiment was venturing into treacherous waters in which only one American vessel, the Empress of China, a ship 5 times larger, had thus far dared to sail. And there were plenty of doubters who predicted calamity for Experiment as it attempted what seemed impossible for so small a ship. But the lure of China's fine tea and porcelain and silk was irresistible. It was America's thirst for tea, after all, a commodity monopolized by the British that played a leading role in the outbreak of the Revolutionary War. And the British defeat caused that tea trade to dry up. And so an enterprising Deane set off from the Hudson River and sailed halfway around the world to bring back tea and more, delivering for Albany a new identity in international commerce in the bargain. Many obstacles lay in the Experiment's path. But to begin with, it was a journey of nearly 14,000 nautical miles, spanning the 2 Atlantics, north and south, around the Cape of Good Hope at Africa's southern tip, across the Indian Ocean, through the dangerous straits of Sunda and Gasper Passage, riddled with rocks and currents, and finally through the South China Sea to Canton in China. Often stormy, and the only aids to navigation in that day were simple compasses and charts that were not always accurate. Deane's ship passed from tropical to Arctic climates, making for extremely volatile temperatures and wind fluctuations. In addition, Experiment sailed with a constant threat of pirate attack, for which they carried a modest insurance policy amounting to a pair of 10-pound carriage guns, 12 small arms, 4 blunderbusses, and 2 pairs of pistols, along with supplies of gunpowder and ammunition.
We're here in the wheelhouse of this modern ship, and as I look around, I see electronic equipment here that is something that I am not familiar with, quite frankly. It's all been developed in the years since World War II. At that time, we did not have the fancy equipment that there is on this ship here, but we did have what would have been considered very fancy equipment as compared to what Captain Deane had. To me, it's just really amazing that that small vessel could find her way out to China and back. It certainly took a lot of courage because there were very few charts of the waters that they had to sail through, and it's quite a remarkable thing to do.
Stuart Deane was an orphan born on the 4th of July. He was raised by a relative. Stuart Deane grew up on Maryland's eastern shore and learned to sail as a small boy on the Chesapeake Bay. At the age of 21, he moved to Albany. Deane was a handsome man of medium height with an adventurous spirit and a strong belief in the principles of freedom and democracy. He served with distinction during the American Revolution as commandant of the ships of war Beaver and Nimrod. He captured several much larger British vessels during fierce naval battles. His last engagement nearly cost him his life. So serious were his wounds that he was returned to Albany to convalesce. Now, Deane's sense of duty was strong, and as soon as he was able to get around, he was back in action, marching as a volunteer with the infantry in the Mohawk Valley. It was this courage and tenacity that enabled him to sail the sloop Experiment to China and earn for her the title Queen of the World's Single Stickers, single-masted boats. The voyage of the Experiment was a remarkable maritime feat by the standards of any era.
It's an ideal case study which illustrates the whole issue, and it does it a lot more completely, I think, probably than even the first voyage, which is very well documented. But we have a lot more information, a lot more background on this. And also, this is a more typical instance from what I can tell. I think that they may have, one of the constraints, one of the reasons I think that such a small ship was used is that this was a very speculative venture. It was expensive, it needed a lot of investment, and anything very much larger than this would probably have required a lot more risk. And I don't think anybody really had that kind of money available to want to invest, to take that kind of risk. When the Experiment was originally built, it was owned by Dean and Van Vechten. And then subsequently, Stewart and Jones took up a third share, and it was operated like a normal business venture. They just ran it. Either they were chartering it out or they were carrying their own cargoes. What was different about the China voyage was that they it needed a lot of investment. The total cost of this voyage was around £11,000. That was a large amount of money. And so the way that it was put together was by selling in total 19 shares of around £600 each, so that no one individual was in the voyage for too much money. The other part of it also is that a single voyage, they had to anticipate it was going to take about 2 years. And that would, for one individual to invest the £10,000 or £11,000, which is about, in modern terms, about $500,000, they would have had to not only find the $500,000, which would have been a major operation in itself, but also be willing to invest it and have no return on it for 2 years. So this particular pattern became something that was adopted by practically every other early voyage to China.
Today, cargo shipments at the Port of Albany go unnoticed as an everyday occurrence in the life of the city. However, the establishment of international commerce at our port traces its roots to Dean and Experiment. By his voyage to China, Dean proved more than his seamanship. In a less tangible way, he lifted the fortunes of his hometown. The voyage of Experiment marked a defining moment in the history of commerce and economic development in Albany as well. Spurred by Dean's gutsy feat, Albany widened its horizons and began to look beyond a local Hudson River trade to that of international merchant.
He's a dynamic force, and community life goes on, except for some kind of traumatic experience. Communities evolve at a certain pace. Stuart Dean literally comes from nowhere and is one of the agents of change. He's one of the first people to break out of the Hudson River carrying trade and to take it to the West Indies. And then he goes one step farther after the war and goes global. And he's you were talking with Paul before about how extraordinary was he. For Albany, he was top of the line. He was someone who was the most, not daring, but the most enterprising. It's a quarter of the size of New York City, although it's one of the boom towns of the New Republic. I mean, Albany and Baltimore and Lancaster, Pennsylvania, these are the coming places. And if you look at population, after 1790, its population is going to double almost every census. By 1812, it's the fastest growing city in the country. I think people like Dean jump-started that kind of energy. They're the agents of change, newcomers. James Caldwell, who opens a factory. Samuel Stringer, who's a scientific physician. That's the new energy that makes this a boomtown. It makes the traditional Albany people train up to a new standard. And the New Englanders are the best at setting that higher standard. Some people do, others leave. But it saves Albany from becoming a backwater like Kingston, that doesn't draw the new people.
Given his historic accomplishments and his significant influence on the character of Albany, history has not been kind to Captain Stuart Dean and the achievement of Experiment. Largely ignored by historians and forgotten by even lifelong Albanians, the status of Dean might be measured by the street named in his honor upon his triumphant return from China. Dean Street, once a main thoroughfare a stone's throw from the shores of the mighty Hudson, is essentially a dead-end alleyway today, out of sight and out of mind, ironically swallowed up by the city's growth to which Dean himself contributed. Dean Street also no longer borders the river's edge. The Hudson River Basin Dean knew is now filled in along the central downtown area, having been done so over the decades to accommodate the city's burgeoning business and industrial development. Now, 2 centuries after his remarkable achievement, Captain Stuart Dean finally is getting his due. Under commission from Key Corp, the eminent historical painter Len Tantillo is ensuring Dean and Experiment their proper place in history. On a canvas as broad as Dean's maritime ambition, Tantillo has captured with historical precision and high drama both the exactitude of the period and a sense of limitless commercial possibility the Experiment left as its legacy to Albany.
The reason for painting historical subjects in the first place is that I think that our community, and by that I mean upstate New York, is not very well documented. In a way, I think the people who live around here have a slight historical inferiority complex. They believe that American history happened somewhere else. And when you start to look through the history of upstate New York, the Capital District, Western New York, you start to find incredibly fascinating things that have happened there. But I also think that Stuart Dean is really one of us. I mean, he's a resident of this part of the world. He teaches us a very basic truth about the human spirit and a can-do attitude that was very much a part of the development of this country. And sometimes I think in our day we're beaten down by the news, that the news can be so oppressive and discouraging. But that spirit that drove us to where we are today is still alive in us. And I think that Stuart Dean epitomizes that. And because of that, he's a character he's worth bringing forward once again. He embodies a lot of the best aspects of the American spirit. I'd like to hope that painting could act as some kind of a regenerator of our enthusiasm and harbor some respect for people who have gone before us. I hope that people who see that painting will come away with it feeling encouraged.
Return of the Experiment, which Tantillo has worked on for 2 years from initial research to completion, measures 4 feet high and 8 feet across. Both for its size and complexity, it is the most ambitious painting Tantillo has done during a decade's work, including dozens of projects in the historical genre. Return of the Experiment was commissioned by Key Corp. It's not the first such commission Tantillo received from this banking and financial services company. 3 years ago, Tantillo completed a large historical painting of Buffalo Harbor, which is currently on display in Key Bank of New York's Fountain Plaza branch in Center City, Buffalo. Key Corp's commission for Return of the Experiment originated with the company's chairman and CEO, Victor J. Riley, Jr. Not only an avid admirer of Tantillo's work, Victor Riley also has displayed a personal, deep, and abiding interest in Albany's history.
I think that the community owes Key Corp a debt of gratitude. I think that the fact that this painting exists at all is due to the enthusiastic response of Key Corp to this idea. It's been a terrific opportunity for me, and I hope that the community feels that their lives have been enriched by this process. I guess time will tell.
Executing the concept was another matter for Tantillo. Historical material about Dean and the experiment was limited and not readily accessible. So Tantillo went digging. He investigated numerous libraries, archives, and maritime museums. His historical sleuthing led him from nautical collections in England to the cemetery where Dean is buried in New York City. Tantillo even threw a costume picnic at his home in Rensselaer County, for which guests dressed in 18th century attire typical of the Albany area. Tantillo photographed the costume partygoers to use later as models for the crowds lining the wharf to view experiment's triumphant return. As a kind of warm-up to the final work, Tantillo converted months of research and sketches into 3 small paintings: a view of experiment at sea and portraits of Dean and his Chinese counterpart, the renowned trader and leader of the Hong merchants, Hao Qua. Before he ever put brush to canvas on the large painting, though, there was a long trial and error period that involved drawing sketches and building scale models. Tantillo considered every possible angle before settling upon the perspective that eventually found its way into the painting.
After several attempts, I realized that I didn't know enough about the city of Albany's architecture and the layout of the city to be able to produce a credible image. So I decided to build a model. And I spent several weeks constructing a 1/4-inch scale model of the city of Albany, the major buildings, the Dutch houses, the docks. And once I had the model together, I started making some sketches and analyzing different points of view. And from there emerged a kind of a sweeping, an idea to do a sweeping panoramic kind of a painting where you could see most of the city. You could definitely see all of the waterfront. And it was a point that was taken south of the city so that we could have a view of experiment in the foreground approaching a landing. I've taken how I feel this event might have affected the lives of people in Albany, and I've created a scene. In my scene, it is early spring. Stuart Dean has been making his way north toward Albany. His ship has been becalmed about 10 miles south of the city. He's waiting for the slightest breeze to carry him north. His ship has been noticed by some farmers who carry the information to Albany, so people start to gather at the dock in anticipation of his arrival. The breeze picks up out of the southwest, and Dean is able to move. The breeze is very slight, so the crew, he's used every bit of canvas that he has to keep some momentum going. He's within 150 yards of his landing point, and the crew has started to take down the mainsail. The scenario is an invention of mine. We really don't know when Stuart Dean arrived. For all we know, it could have been at night. It could have been in a storm. But the painting, I think, is more of a symbolic representation of the arrival of Stuart Dean and not a literal one. And with that kind of freedom, I'm portraying it in a very positive kind of light.
I think they were probably great sailors. I think they had a good deal of experience in oceanic work. They did a lot of work to make sure that the sloop was well equipped and seaworthy for this particular voyage. I mean, there was a lot of refitting and re-rigging to make it more suitable for a long voyage. He was handling a very small vessel. I mean, the sloop was 80 tons and under 60 feet in length. People get worried about, I mean, the Coast Guard nowadays gets worried about something that size going down to the Caribbean. And he was taking it halfway around the world and via the Cape of Good Hope, which wasn't called the Cape of Storms for nothing. Basically, the Cape itself is near enough on the roaring 40s, and the reason they call the roaring 40s is there's no land in between to interrupt the waves as they come and the wind as it goes around the globe at that point. So there's always a heavy sea there. It's not an easy job, and not in a small vessel.
Before 1783, when the Treaty of Paris was signed, all China trade goods had to come, if they were coming to the United States, England. This was the law. There were no direct trade routes from America to China. And it wasn't until the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1783 that we were then free to trade directly with the Chinese. Since we as a new nation were free now to trade with China, it was first come, first serve, and everyone made an effort to get there before anyone else. And the reason for that is that if you went over and brought back a shipload of tea and you were the first one, then your tea would sell. And it happened over and over again that traders would return and not having the most up-to-date news would have purchased something that was now a glut on the market, and they would then therefore lose their investment. So it was very important to get there as quickly as possible, to also know either through your own agents in China or through the information of other traders what it was that was selling best, both there and here. Stuart Dean brought to China 2 barrels of silver, and these were Spanish silver dollars, the general trade coinage at the time that all nations dealt with. He also brought ginseng from upstate New York, and this was a commodity. The ginseng was an exotic commodity that the traders found out that the Chinese valued highly, and this was something that they could trade. There wasn't much that the United States could trade at the time. With the silver, the Western merchants would then trade for what was the most valuable commodity for export generally, and that was tea. The second most valuable commodity was silk, and the third would be porcelain and other miscellaneous goods. Once they reached Canton, or what we now call Guangzhou, they had a set procedure for the trade. They all had to stop in Macau, and by they I mean every Western trader. The system was called the Canton system, and what you did initially was to stop in Macau, and there was a Portuguese settlement. It is still a Portuguese settlement today. There you'd pick up a river pilot and a translator, and they would escort you and direct you up the Pearl River. You would pass first Boca Tigres, which was a narrowing in the river, and at that point there were forts on either side to protect the trade. You would proceed up the Pearl River to Whampoa Reach, where you would anchor your ship, and all Western ships had to anchor there. They would remain there during the whole trading period. Dean himself would be allowed to go up to Guangzhou or Canton. The captain, the supercargo, and other officers were allowed to go to Canton. And there was a quarter-mile strip of land to which all Westerners were confined. That area was built up with Western-style buildings, built by the Chinese and rented by them on a seasonal basis to the Westerners. The Westerners would rent the buildings. Flags of the various countries would be raised in front of those buildings. The merchants would live on the second and third floors and conduct all their business on the first floor. The first floor was where they would store their goods that they were bringing to trade, and where they would store the tea and the silk and the other goods that they were acquiring until they were ready to sail. And at that point, the goods would be loaded on Chinese junks, brought down to Whampoa Reach again, loaded on the ships, and then sail back home. Each of the hongs, or factory buildings in Canton, was under the control of an individual Chinese merchant or Hong merchant. And these Hong merchants were in charge of making sure that the Western merchants behaved themselves and that all trade went as required and that all duties were paid, etc. One of these Hong merchants was Haokwa. Haokwa got along very well with American merchants, became great friends with many of them, including Dean. He would often give his Western counterpart a portrait of himself as a souvenir. Haokwa, because of his good business acumen, acquired a tremendous fortune and is considered to be the wealthiest man alive at the time of his death.
Dean quickly befriended Haokwa, possibly because Dean attracted much attention in port due to the size of experiment and its successful voyage from America. Soon after, his friendship and the cargo he brought won him the ability to secure a full vessel of Chinese commodities for his return voyage to America. Now, you might wonder, are there any relics existing today from this voyage?
All the historic records point to the fact that this cup and saucer was from China. It's the right time period. It also descended through the Tenike family. They were the donors to the Albany Institute. And there's a wonderful little article in the Albany newspapers about 1850, which talks about a set of china that traveled on the experiment coming to a family in Albany. And it was the Tenike family. They're interesting because they're rather unpretentious designs. They're very simple. It's a lavender border with some flowers. And these are is the type of Chinese export porcelain that was made before 1790. After 1790, the designs made for the American market were very elaborate and very decorative. So this is a rather simple sort of country design. The Chinese had perfected the development of porcelain over a long period of time. So it was very, very fine china, probably among the finest available. And also it was really status to be able to have your china or your tea set come from such an exotic country as China.
Well, at the beginning of the voyage, even though, as I mentioned, Dean and his partners already owned the ship, they sold it to the partnership. And at the end of the voyage, everything was sold, right down to, yeah, literally down to the anchors and the sails and the cordage. Everything was sold. And then whatever return was made on that was divided between the partners. The total that shows up on in the accounts is about, I think it's 988 pounds, which was divided between into 19 shares and spread around between the various shareholders. That was on what they actually sold. My guess, and this is a guess, but I don't think it had to have been more profitable than this. My impression of Dean is that he was a very competent, very professional seaman. He was prepared to take large risks. He took them, I think, having weighed up the consequences. I don't get any sense of him being reckless or irresponsible. He was certainly not in this business or in most of his other ventures, from what I can tell, for the money that he was going to make out of it. I think maybe more from a sense of accomplishment. And one of the things that I think emerges when we look at, for instance, Crevecoeur's description of him, when he meets him afterwards and he's sailing up and down the Hudson River, he seems to have been quite happy by this time. He's settled down. Maybe it's having all those children that induces this. But he becomes a pretty staid, settled-down family man.
Stuart Dean spent many happy years after his return from China in his home in Albany, overlooking the Hudson on what is now Arbor Hill. Surrounded by many of his 12 children and numerous grandchildren, Dean was the elder statesman of the river trade, sailing goods back and forth from Albany to New York City.
If we were living back in his day, we would know Stuart Dean. He would be someone that we'd be familiar with, the way we're familiar with people of great accomplishment who live in this area today. I think that I absolutely respect Stuart Dean.
On August 4th, 1836, Captain Stuart Dean died at the age of 89 at the home of his son-in-law in New York City. He was buried in the DeVoe and Marvin underground vault in the New York Marble Cemetery amid skyscrapers in Lower Manhattan, not far from his beloved Hudson River. Over 150 years later, the same Hudson River continues its flow past Albany, not only serving the local gentry as a recreational and sporting focal point, but also serving as a unique passageway to the world community, rich in culture, trade, and opportunity. Perhaps it was this vision leading down the river and onto Canton which led Stuart Dean to engage in what was probably the greatest adventure of his life. To sail round trip from Albany to China in a 60-foot sloop with a crew of 9 under the most primitive conditions certainly speaks a powerful message, not only about the person of Stuart Dean, but also about those who believed in him enough to either accompany him as a crewmate or assist in financing the adventure. The characteristics of these types of individuals who gazed out at the Hudson River with a vision of opportunity are at the very heart of the foundation of Albany. They influenced us to become what we are today. And through Len Tantillo's Return of the Experiment, they continue to inspire us to what we can become tomorrow. I'm Ernie Tatro. Good day.
You tend to let your imagination move into the painting. And so I don't know about actually living in Albany 200 years ago, but I have a sense about being in the painting, about what it's like in the painting, imagining myself on some of the streets that I've painted, or actually standing in front of some of those buildings, or watching this kind of gradual evolution that takes place in the river traffic. So that part of it does feel a little bit like a time machine, and that's the part of it that I want to convey to the viewer. I'd like the viewer to stand in front of that painting and be able to imagine herself or himself in that scene.
Mm-hmm.